The first time Sophie Mitchell met Alex Hartley, she was holding a coffee she hadn't touched and a folder she'd stayed up until 3 in the morning to finish. She didn't leave until 11 that night. She ordered takeout she forgot to eat. She filled 17 pages of a legal pad with observations. He said she should try to get home before 2. She said she'd consider it. She stayed there for 5 minutes, holding a cup of cold coffee she had no intention of drinking. She poured it out, grabbed her bag, and walked to the elevator. She pressed the button and waited. The elevator doors opened. He was inside. He looked up from his phone, a beat of surprise on both sides. He said he changed his mind about going home. She stepped inside. The doors closed. They rode down in silence. 14 floors. The doors opened to the lobby. He gestured for her to go first. She walked out. Outside, the air was cold and empty. He said goodnight. She said goodnight back. She walked to the subway and didn't look back. But when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she stopped, just for a second, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She had spent the weekend in the office. She had rewritten the presentation 3 times. She typed it up at midnight, ran it through her internal filter twice, deleted 3 adverbs, and went home. She had memorized the numbers until she could recite them in her sleep. She had practiced the delivery in front of her bathroom mirror on Monday morning, and again on Tuesday. On Wednesday she stopped, because she realized she was overthinking it. Thursday morning, she put on her best suit, walked into the conference room, and did what she had been trained to do. The client was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a handshake that could stop traffic. She asked hard questions. Sophie answered them. She asked harder ones. Sophie answered those too. She said she appreciated someone who'd actually done the reading. Sophie said she didn't know how to do it any other way. The woman smiled. Alex Hartley was sitting at the far end of the table. He didn't interrupt. He didn't add anything. She was back at her desk by 7 the next morning. She made 4 small changes and walked it to his office at 8:30. He was watching the client's face, not the materials, watching her reaction. When the client smiled, something in his expression shifted. Not a smile, but close. The client said she wanted Sophie on every call from now on. After the client left, the conference room emptied. Sophie gathered her materials, her hands still holding the energy of the last hour. She felt lightheaded in a way that had nothing to do with the coffee she hadn't touched. She looked for him. He was already gone. Jenna was waiting, leaning against the wall with a coffee in each hand. Jenna said she heard it went well. Sophie said it went well. Jenna said she didn't mean the case. The rest of the day passed in a blur of follow-up emails and congratulatory messages. At 7, she packed her bag and checked her desk one last time. He was already there. Of course he was. There was a piece of paper on her keyboard she hadn't noticed. A sticky note. Small. Yellow. Handwritten. She read it 4 times. His office door was closed. She folded the note carefully, precisely, and slid it into the pocket of her blazer. She walked to the elevator, her hand in her pocket, the corner of the note pressed between her fingers. She unfolded it on her kitchen counter and read it one more time. She put it in the drawer of her bedside table, under a book she wasn't reading, and closed the drawer. It happened in a Tuesday morning meeting, the kind that should have been unremarkable. Sophie had been asked to present the findings from the forensic analysis she'd been working on. David Mercer sat 2 chairs down from Alex, at the opposite end of the table, with the relaxed posture of someone who'd already decided how the meeting was going to go. She held up the folder and asked if he remembered telling her Friday. A pause. He took it without opening it. He said he did remember. Sophie presented for 10 minutes. She walked through the inconsistencies she'd found. Partners asked questions. She answered them. Then David Mercer leaned forward. He asked, in a voice that was perfectly pleasant, whether she'd considered standard accounting variance. Alex Hartley spoke before she could. His voice was flat, unraised, and cut through the room like a blade. He said she'd considered it. She'd documented it in Appendix C of her report. He suggested that if David had read the full memo before the meeting, he'd have seen that. The room went still. Alex said she should continue. She closed her laptop when it was over and sat down without remembering a single word she'd said in the last 5 minutes. She had no idea what to do next. So she thanked him and walked back to her desk. For the next 3 hours, she couldn't focus. She gathered her materials with mechanical precision and walked into the hallway. She made it 10 steps before she heard his voice behind her. He called her name. He said he shouldn't have done that. He said he'd interrupted her presentation. He said she deserved the chance to handle it herself. He said she was right, for the record, about the financial analysis. She'd found something real. He said David shouldn't have asked that question the way he did. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked back toward the conference room. She stood in the hallway for a full 30 seconds before she could move again. She walked back to her desk and sat down and stared at her computer screen. Her hands were shaking. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jenna. Did that just happen? At 1 in the afternoon, an email from his assistant, Mr. Hartley would like to see you in his office at 2:30. Sophie typed back, I don't know. Jenna replied, you know. Sophie closed her email and sat in the silence of her own office. She thought about the way he'd said her name in the hallway. Not Mitchell. Not associate. He'd said Sophie. She didn't know when he'd started calling her that. The week after the meeting was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Alex Hartley stopped coming to her desk. He stopped sending late-night emails. He assigned her work through his assistant instead of directly. She told herself she was imagining it. She spent the hour and a half rehearsing. Maybe she'd missed something. Maybe 17 pages was overkill. She told herself that he was busy, that the case was demanding. She watched the light under his door go out at 6:30, ridiculously early for him, night after night. Night after night. On Thursday, Jenna stopped by her desk with a bagel and an observation. Jenna asked if something had happened with Hartley. Sophie said nothing had happened. Jenna bit into her bagel and said that was the problem. Wasn't it? Jenna said she noticed the way Sophie checked the hallway when she walked past his office. The way her phone became interesting whenever she picked it up. Jenna said she wasn't asking Sophie to tell her anything. She was asking Sophie to tell herself. At 2:27, she walked to his office. He was reading her work. She stood in the doorway and watched him turn pages, his expression giving away exactly nothing. Sophie said she didn't know what Jenna was talking about. Jenna said that was the second time in 5 minutes she'd said that. Jenna walked back to her own office. Sophie sat at her desk for a long time. She didn't pull up the Chandler Green files. She didn't check her email. She let herself ask the question she'd been avoiding for 7 days. She didn't answer it, but she let it land. At the end of the day, after the floor had emptied and the cleaning crew had started their rounds, she closed her office door. She opened her browser. She typed, Firm Policy Mentor-Associate Relationship. She read the sections about professional boundaries. She read the section about conflicts of interest. He read the last page, set the folder down, didn't look up. 1 second. 2. He said she did good work. She read the section about what constituted a reportable relationship. She closed the browser. She closed her laptop. She sat in the dark of her office and didn't move for a long time. She hadn't found an answer. She had found a question she wasn't ready to ask. The Chandler Green case took a turn on a Friday afternoon, when opposing counsel filed a motion that changed everything. New evidence had surfaced. The trial date was moved up. Alex Hartley called a meeting for Saturday morning. Everyone on the team, no exceptions. He was standing at the whiteboard, mapping out the new strategy in handwriting she recognized. The meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end, the team had been restructured. Sophie had been assigned to the document review team that would be working directly with him for the next 3 weeks. She told herself this was fine, professional, necessary. She told herself this 3 times before she stopped needing to. The next 3 weeks were a blur. She arrived before him and left after him. He was already seated at the conference table when she walked in, reading her file, and he didn't look up when the door opened. He asked if that was the only thing. Friday was a test, not of her speed, but of whether she'd tell him when a deadline was unreasonable. She hadn't. They worked in the same room for hours without speaking, the silence filled by the sound of pages turning and keyboards clicking. He left notes on her desk, typed instructions, efficient and impersonal. They had constructed a system of professional distance so precise that they could work side by side without touching anything that mattered. Then the client requested an in-person meeting in Philadelphia. 2 days, overnight stay. The firm booked them on the same train. He worked the whole way. She worked the whole way. They exchanged exactly 4 sentences, all of them about the case. She watched him read the same page for 5 minutes and realized he wasn't reading it. Client meeting went well, better than well. The client was impressed. By the time they returned to the hotel lobby that evening, the exhaustion had settled into something heavy and shared. He asked if she wanted to get dinner. She said it wasn't unreasonable. Something shifted in his face, not a smile. But whatever it was, she saw it. She said yes before she could stop herself. They ate at a small restaurant near the hotel, the kind with warm lighting and tables close together. They talked about the case. Then they ran out of case to talk about. He told her he'd been avoiding her. She said she knew. He looked at her for a long moment, deciding whether to say the next thing. He didn't say it. He paid the bill and stood up and said they should get some rest. They walked back to the hotel in silence. He held the door for her. The ride up was 4 floors. He was standing close enough that she could smell his coat, rain and coffee and something she couldn't name. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. He said goodnight. She said goodnight back. She walked back to her desk and stared at her computer for a full minute before she realized she wasn't going to get any more work done today. She walked to her room, unlocked the door, and stood in the dark for a long time before she turned on the light. He looked at her differently after Philadelphia. She couldn't name it at first. It was in the way his gaze held a beat too long across the conference table, the way he said her name, then paused, like he'd said more than he meant to. She told herself it was the case. The pressure of Chandler Green made everyone strange. But that was a lie she didn't believe, and she knew it. Thursday night, 10 o'clock, she had a file to deliver to his office. She stood in the doorway. The office was dark. No desk lamp. No reading light. Just the city beyond the window and a silhouette she almost didn't recognize. Sophie. His voice came from the dark. He was there, not reading, not working, just sitting in the dark with his hands on the armrests. I was engaged once. 3rd year, also a lawyer. She lasted 18 months. She said I treated relationships like a schedule. She said I didn't know how to be present. Sophie didn't know what to say. She stood in the dark and let the words settle around her like dust she couldn't see. I don't think she was right. The words came out before she had fully decided to say them. Her phone buzzed. Jenna, asking if she could meet for coffee. Sophie typed back that there was nothing to tell. Jenna replied, liar, 10 minutes. You take your coffee with oat milk and cinnamon. You told me once in an email about a morning meeting in February. You never told me again, but you always order it the same way. Sophie's breath caught. She remembered the email. 7 words in a thread about a deposition schedule. She'd forgotten she'd even written it. He said, very quietly, I notice things, Sophie. The air in the room changed. He stood up and walked to the window. He stood at the window with his back to her and looked out at the city for a long time. Below them, the city stretched out in a grid of lights. It looked calm from up here. Orderly, the way he liked things. You should go home, Sophie. The words came out quiet, not an instruction, something closer to a plea. She didn't leave. She stood in the doorway and felt the weight of what he was not saying. I want you to know I meant what I said about your ex being wrong. He didn't turn around. He didn't answer. He stood at the window with his back to her and let the silence fill the room. Sophie smiled at her screen. Then she closed her computer and grabbed her bag. She turned and walked away before she could take it back. The hallway was empty. Her footsteps were the only sound in the building. She made it back to her desk, sat down, didn't open anything, just sat there in her own dark. She replayed the conversation in her head. His voice in the dark, the way he said her name, the way he remembered. She looked toward his office. The light was still off. The door was still ajar. Her phone buzzed. A message from a number she now knew by heart. Good night, Sophie. She stared at the screen. The cursor blinked. She typed and deleted 3 responses before she found the one she sent. She typed, Good night, Alex? She put the phone down and sat in the quiet of the empty office, still tasting his name on her tongue. Friday night. The office was nearly empty. Sophie stood in Jenna's doorway with the look of someone who had run out of places to hide. The deposition was scheduled for Monday at 9. Sophie was in the conference room at 7:30, arranging the exhibits in the order she'd spent the weekend memorizing. Jenna looked up from her computer and closed the laptop without a word. She knew. Sophie told her everything. The dark office, the engagement, the coffee order, the way he said her name like it cost him something. They ended up on the floor of Jenna's office, takeout containers spread between them. A bottle of red wine sat between them, unopened. Sophie hadn't touched it. Jenna asked the question Sophie had been avoiding. If he weren't your mentor, would you feel the same way? Sophie opened her mouth, closed it. She had rehearsed a dozen answers for this question, and now she couldn't remember a single one. Jenna said, very quietly, The answer matters, Sophie. Not to me. To you. Sophie went home and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the question until it lost all meaning. She saw 2 paths in the dark above her: clean exit, transfer to another department, never see him again, or messy stay. She told herself the answer was obvious: clean exit. It was the only smart choice. She'd printed an extra set for herself. Color, coded by witness, with sticky notes marking the lines she wanted to revisit. She didn't sleep. When the alarm went off at 6, she was still in the same position, staring at the same patch of ceiling. Monday morning. Sophie walked into the office earlier than usual, before anyone else arrived. She sat down at her desk and opened the internal portal. The transfer request form was exactly where she remembered. She clicked the form and started filling it out. Name, department, date. She stopped at the reason field. The cursor blinked in the empty box, waiting. She stared at the blinking cursor for a long time. She closed the window. She told herself she would do it next week, after the case was over. When things were less complicated, she opened her email. A message from him, sent 10 minutes ago. Subject, Chandler. Green deposition transcript. Body, page 34. Your call? She was flipping through the transcript when the door opened. Alex Hartley walked in with a cup of coffee and an expression that said he'd been up for hours. She opened the attachment. A scanned deposition transcript with handwriting in the margin. She found the line, a witness statement she had questioned in her initial memo. He had circled it. In the margin, in his handwriting, you were right. She read it 3 times. The 2 words that meant he'd remembered. He'd gone back to her first memo. He'd checked. She understood what he was doing. He wasn't just showing her she was right. He was telling her he saw her. She closed the email without replying. She didn't submit the form. She left the portal open in another tab and told herself it was just for now, but she knew. The night before the trial, the office was empty. Everyone had gone home hours ago. Sophie had been there since 7 in the morning. She'd left once to grab coffee. She came back to find a sandwich on her desk, a sticky note on top in handwriting she recognized. Eat something. He looked at her setup, the neat rows of paper, the color coding, the sticky notes, and said nothing. She didn't look toward his office. She didn't need to. She already knew. She ate it standing up, reading through the witness list one more time. At 9 in the evening, she heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, stopping at her door. He was standing in her doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. He said she was still here. She said so was he. He set the second cup on her desk. He said the trial prep was in the conference room if she wanted to go over it one last time. She said she would be there in 5 minutes. She was there in 3. Conference room was lit only by the overheads, casting long shadows across the long table. The documents were spread out in neat rows, exhibits, witness outlines, timelines, everything in its place. They worked for an hour, quiet, efficient, the rhythm they had developed over months of late nights. He sat down at the head of the table and started reading his own notes. They passed documents without speaking. They finished each other's sentences without acknowledging it. At 10, he closed the last file and said they were ready. Sophie said she knew. He said she should go home and get some sleep. Tomorrow was going to be long. Neither of them moved. He said her name, Sophie. Just her name, but the way he said it, like a question he was afraid to ask. He walked around the table. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the tiredness in his eyes, the slight unevenness of his collar. He said her name again, Sophie, like he was asking permission without knowing how to ask. His hand moved, slowly, like he was giving her time to stop it. She didn't stop it. She stood in the doorway a beat too long. A woman in a sharp blazer gestured to the empty chair across from him. Sophie sat. He didn't look up. They didn't speak until the client arrived, but she noticed that he glanced at her color. Coded stack twice before he opened his mouth. His fingers brushed her wrist. Light. Barely there. A question. And then his phone rang. The sound cut through the room like a blade. He pulled his hand back. She stepped away. The moment shattered into fragments. She stood alone among the scattered documents. Her wrist was still warm where he'd touched it. She walked to the elevator. She stepped inside. She touched her wrist with her other hand. The doors closed. The morning of the trial, Sophie arrived at the office before sunrise. The streets were empty. She'd slept badly. 3 hours, maybe 4. Her wrist still carried the memory of a touch that had lasted less than 2 seconds. She'd told herself, in the dark of her apartment, that it didn't mean anything. She told herself until she stopped believing it. He was already in the conference room when she arrived. He looked up when she walked in. Their eyes met. Neither of them said anything about last night. The deposition lasted 3 hours. Sophie watched him work the way she'd watched him in meetings. Efficient, controlled, precise. He asked if she was ready. She said she was. The courtroom was everything she had imagined. High ceilings, dark wood, the weight of procedure pressing down from every angle. Sophie sat at the counsel table and watched Alex Hartley do what he did best. He asked questions that sounded simple and weren't. He let witnesses talk themselves into corners and then closed the door behind them. She should have been taking notes. She was, mechanically, her pen moving across the page in a rhythm she had practiced for years. But at one point, during a cross-examination about the financial projections, when the courtroom was silent and all eyes were on him, she looked at his hands. The hands that had touched her wrist. She looked at them for 1 second, maybe 2. She knew, in that second, that she could no longer separate the lawyer from the man. She looked back at her notes. No one had noticed. He asked questions that sounded simple until you realized they weren't. He let the witness talk long enough to hang himself and then pulled the rope. The trial lasted 3 days. Sophie stayed in the room for every minute of it. She took notes she would never read. She passed documents she had prepared a dozen times. On the second day, the rhythm of the courtroom settled into something almost routine. Almost. On the third day, the jury returned. The verdict was in their favor. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration, handshakes, murmured congratulations. Sophie stood at the counsel table, her hands flat on the wood, and let herself feel the weight of what they had accomplished. She looked for him. He was across the room, shaking hands with the client. He didn't look at her. The firm threw a celebration that evening. Champagne in the conference room. Speeches, the kind of gathering where everyone pretended the past 3 months had been normal. She stayed for an hour. He wasn't there. She passed his office on the way to the restroom. The door was closed. When the break came, she stepped into the hallway to collect her thoughts. She checked his office twice before she admitted to herself that she was looking for him. The door was closed. The light was off. He wasn't there. She walked to the elevator alone, the way she had arrived. The email arrived at 7:23 a.m. David Mercer's assistant requesting a meeting at Ms. Mitchell's earliest convenience. Sophie stared at it for a full minute before her fingers moved. Once. To reply. I'd be happy to. What time works? Short. Professional. Safe. The walk to Mercer's office was shorter than she expected. The carpet, the walls all the same, but the air felt different here. The decor was different here, warmer, older, wood paneling instead of glass. The light from inside was amber, not fluorescent. Mercer sat behind his desk, a white coffee cup in his hand. He looked up as she closed the door. He smiled. Not the sharp, evaluating look she knew from Alex, a warmer one, almost welcoming. He followed her out. He asked what she thought. I've been watching your work for a while, Ms. Mitchell. He said it like a simple observation, not a compliment. Every single document you draft crosses my desk, he said. Every brief, every memo. I read them all. I'm offering you a position on my team, he said. I need someone like you. Don't be flattered, he added, almost as an afterthought. Be smart about this. He's never assigned a junior associate partner, level work. You know what that means, Ms. Mitchell. What's said in this room stays in this room. His eyes met hers. That's a promise. 48 hours. Think it over. He set the cup down. And remember, my door is always open. Sophie walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. Soft, final. She stood in the empty hallway, not moving. The silence pressed in from all sides. For the first time in her career, the word choice meant something dangerous, something irreversible. She said the witness was hiding something in the third quarter around the financial projections. She could hear it in the language shift, the way he'd started answering questions with questions. She walked back to her desk. Everything in front of her looked exactly the same. Nothing was the same. Alex was coming down the hall, a file in his hand. He stopped near her desk. He saw her face. The question hung unasked in the space between them. He said nothing. Sophie packed her bag and left the office without looking back. The building hummed on without her. On the subway, she watched the city blur past. Her own face stared back from the dark glass. The reflection in the window looked like a stranger. Same suit, same tired eyes, completely different woman. Her apartment was dark when she walked in. She didn't bother with the lights. She stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. The skyline was a wall of other people's lives. Her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. A new notification broke the darkness. David Mercer. My door is always open, Ms. Mitchell. 3 sentences. Measured, kind. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said she was right. Sophie didn't sleep that night. She lay on the couch and watched the ceiling until the sun came up. She didn't sleep. She lay on her back watching the ceiling, watching the headlights sweep across it one after another. At 5 in the morning, she got up. She made a decision before the sun was fully up. It was simple. Really. It came down to one question. She arrived at the firm before anyone else. The office was still and gray in the early light. She sat at her desk and waited. She didn't open her laptop, she just sat. At 7:43, the elevator doors opened. Alex stepped out, coffee in hand, heading toward his corner office. Sophie took a breath. A long one. She walked down the corridor toward his office. Her heels were the only sound in the hall. Sophie started staying later, not because he asked, the case demanded it, and she'd realized the office was quietest between 9 and midnight. She stopped at his door. It was closed. She knocked. "Come in." His voice came through the wood. She opened the door and stepped inside. Then she closed it. She had never closed it before. The latch clicked. The hallway sounds vanished. "Do you want me to stay?" The silence stretched. He looked at his hands. Outside, a car horn sounded, distant and irrelevant. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "You're the best junior associate I've ever worked with." 3 hours of uninterrupted work let her keep up with his pace. She started noticing his light was on, too. "David's team has resources I can't give you. Better clients, bigger deals. You'll advance faster there. You should take it." She stood. "I understand." She turned and walked to the door. Her hand found the handle. She paused. She didn't look back. He didn't speak. Then she was gone, and the room was very quiet. The transfer request was submitted that afternoon. Reason? Personal development. After that, they passed each other in the hall without meeting each other's eyes. Every morning she opened her email to find his resignation notice in the shared case log. She arrived at 9. The hallway was too quiet. She didn't go knock. She thought about it the first night, and the second, and the third. She made arguments for it in her head. His door was open. He wasn't at his desk. She walked over and stood in the doorway. He was taking books off the shelves, boxes stacked at his feet. "Where are you going?" "You saw the resignation letter." Then, "Why?" He stopped. He turned to face her. "I didn't throw them away. I traded them." Their eyes locked. He hadn't said resign. He'd said trade. She stepped inside and closed the door. The meeting was about Chandler Green, a pharmaceutical company the firm had been chasing for 2 years. On Thursday night, she walked past his office on her way out. The door was open. She kissed him. It wasn't tentative. He went still for 1 second. Then he kissed her back, decisive, unmistakable. The tension between them broke. They pulled apart, forehead to forehead. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." They both laughed. It was the first time they had laughed together. They went back to packing. He was reading something with his glasses on, an intimacy she hadn't seen before, a version of him that existed when no one was watching. He folded boxes. She slid books into a box. Neither spoke. They worked together like it was natural. He lifted a box onto his shoulder. She slung a file bag over her shoulder. They walked to the elevator together. They stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. 3 months later, Brooklyn. She spots him through the window, the table by the window. He looks different, thinner. The tightness in his shoulders is gone. She stopped for half a second, long enough to register the image, short enough to pretend she hadn't. He looked up. She slides into the seat across from him. A quiet moment passes. They order? She already knows black, no sugar. They talk about books, the apartment, the weather. Like two people who have time. "How's the new team?" he asks. Mercer was right. The resources are good. But it's not loud. He asks, "What counts as loud?" "It takes 4 opinions to decide on lunch." He laughs. He asked if she was heading out. She said she was. He told her to get some rest. The silence isn't awkward. She turns her phone face down on the table. I quit. He looks at her, waiting for him to be angry or worried. He picks up her phone, turns it over. The screen is off. Turned it off the morning I left. Haven't turned it on since? She freezes. She reaches across the table, palm up. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and didn't look back. He takes her hand. Something between them dissolves. She smiles. His hand tightens around hers. Brooklyn afternoon light spills through the window. More coffee? The server asks. Yes, Sophie says. But on the ride down, she realized he'd never told anyone to get some rest before. The fact that he'd said it, that he'd noticed she was leaving, that he'd offered a sentence closer to concern than instruction sat in her chest. She couldn't name it. She didn't try. The next morning, she arrived at the office and found a document on her desk, a draft of the deposition summary, annotated in his handwriting. Follow this line. Ask about the July meeting. Consider bringing in a forensic accountant. She read it 3 times. He'd spent time on this. Not to fix her work, to push it further. She'd found a hole in the opposing counsel's argument that no one had caught, and she'd inserted it below her analysis. She did this because that was what she did. She took a photo of the first page with her phone. She didn't know why. She didn't know why. 过度使镜头回到时间推进. It was Jenna who told her. They were in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of slow hour between meetings when the office hummed at half volume. Sophie was leaning against the counter, waiting. Jenna said, apropos of nothing visible, that Sophie should know something about the partner she'd been assigned to. Sophie said she was listening. Jenna told her about the last person Hartley had mentored, a senior associate named Derek Chen, brought in from a competing firm with a reputation for being sharp. He'd lasted 6 months. When someone asked him why, he'd said that working with Hartley was like being in a room you couldn't find the door to. The work was good. The growth was real, but you never knew where you stood. Jenna said it like she was delivering information she'd rather not have to share. She said Sophie should know because Sophie was the type of person who'd want to know. Jenna said Hartley had requested Sophie specifically for Chandler Green, and that meant he'd seen something he wanted to test. Alex Hartley ran the meeting without wasted movement. He assigned tasks. He gave deadlines. He didn't look at her once. Jenna didn't want Sophie to mistake the silence for absence of interest. Sophie thought about this for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about it while she reviewed the deposition transcript, while she drafted the memo he'd asked for, while she ate a sandwich at her desk that she barely tasted. She decided she didn't need to know what she'd done wrong. She needed to make sure she never had to find out. That week, she worked harder than she'd ever worked. She came in earlier. She stayed later. She read every file in the Chandler Green case from the beginning. She found 3 inconsistencies in the financial statements that no one had flagged. She drafted a memo explaining each one, and left it on his desk without a note. The next morning, she arrived to find an email from him, not a response to her memo, a new assignment. He wanted her to prepare a witness outline for the next deposition, not assist, prepare. She wrote back that she'd have it by Friday. When the meeting ended, the partners filed out. Sophie stayed seated a moment too long. Jenna caught her eye and gave her a look that said, "You'll get used to it." She finished it Thursday night at 11:30. She was proofreading the final section. When her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He'd found a typo in a contract addendum she'd filed earlier that day, a minor thing. A date that read 2023 instead of 2024. He sent a screenshot with the error circled in red and a single word, fix. She checked the time on the message. 11:07 p.m. She was already looking at the document. She'd spotted the same error 10 minutes ago and had corrected it before he even wrote. She wrote back, already done. Filed at 11:02. 3 dots appeared. disappeared, appeared again. His reply came 2 minutes later. Good. She stared at the word for longer than she should have. He'd been reading her work at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, the same night she was still at her desk. They were in the office, alone, at the same hour, working on the same case, without having planned it. She was gathering her notes when she heard his voice from the doorway. He wanted her take on the liability exposure by Friday. She closed her laptop and walked to the elevator. His light was on. She didn't stop. She didn't look. But she knew. It happened on a Wednesday. The kind of Wednesday that felt like it had been running on a treadmill since Monday. No progress, just motion. She was in the break room at 1 in the morning, waiting for the coffee machine to finish its cycle, when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She didn't turn around. She knew who it was. He walked past the doorway, stopped, and walked back. He was holding an empty mug. He looked at her. She looked at the coffee machine. He said he didn't expect anyone to still be here. He said he could say the same. He didn't smile, but he didn't leave. He stood in the doorway of the break room, holding his mug, and waited for the coffee to finish. The machine beeped. She reached for the pot. He reached at the same time, and they stopped. She gestured for him to go first. He poured. Then he handed her the pot. They stood in the break room at 1 in the morning, holding coffee neither of them would finish. He said she'd been staying late. She said so had he. He said it was different. He was a partner. The building expected him to be here. She asked who was expecting her. He set a manila folder on the table and walked out. The folder contained 400 pages of deposition transcripts and a note. Week 1. Show me what you see. He didn't answer, but he looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, and she understood that the question had landed. He said he'd started at this firm at her age. Same floor, same coffee machine, same unreasonable hours. He said he remembered what it felt like to be the only person on a floor who didn't have a corner office. She said she didn't mind the hours. She'd worked worse jobs for less interesting cases. He said he knew. He said he'd read her file before Chandler. Green. He knew where she'd worked before. He knew the cases she'd worked on. He said the firm didn't assign associates to partners by accident. She said she didn't know he'd done that, read her file before the assignment. He said he always did. The silence that followed was different from the silences in the conference room. Those were about hierarchy. This one was about something else. He finished his coffee in 2 swallows, rinsed the mug in the sink, and set it in the drying rack.